Titus Minucius Vettius led a slave revolt in 104 BCE. Vettius was a member of Rome's equestrian order, a privileged elite that was only one step below the Senate. The equestrian order enjoyed a great deal of privilege and power, and they were wealthy enough to lead a life of leisure. One would think that this would be quite enough to keep their members content, and certainly that members of the equestrian order would not be conspiring against the state, which largely worked in their interest. However, young Titus Minucius Vettius became notorious for being the only non-slave to lead a slave revolt. What was the cause of his discontent? In this video, we'll take a look at that. More to the point, we will also take a look at how his shocking involvement in this revolt really sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and demanded an explanation. We'll take a look at how the Romans reacted to this, how this mini revolt fits in to the larger narrative of the slave revolts that took place from the late 2nd century to the early 1st century, and we will also consider how this affected the Roman imagination, how Roman elites had to try to understand this and process it, and what that tells us about the Roman mindset. So stay tuned for all that and more as we explore the life and deeds of one Titus Minucius Vettius. As I mentioned at the outset, Titus Minucius Vettius was an eques, or member of the equestrian order, who lived in the region of Campania during the late 2nd century. Campania was just to the south of Rome. It was a rich agricultural area, and it was also the most desired spot for a Roman elite to own land. This area not only gave rich harvests, but it also was strategically close to Rome for easy access, and it was also apparently quite beautiful and pleasant. This was something like what the Hamptons are to New York City, a nearby retreat for the elite. In Cicero's letters from approximately 50 years after this period, we see that a lot of senior statesmen were very eager to retreat to their estates in Campania to get away from the grind and the hustle and the dirt of Rome, and to get out where the air was fresh and the crops are flourishing. A wealthy young man, we don't know exactly how old Vettius was, but the use of the word young would imply that he's under 30. Vettius came from a family that was not quite rich enough for a life in politics, but he certainly was rich enough to have a life of leisure. Most likely, Vettius's parents were able to equip him with a decent education. Most likely, Vettius never traveled to Greece or anything like that to study at Rhodes or Athens, but if his parents were very dedicated to his studies, that could have happened. They probably would have had enough wealth to swing that, although it may have been a slight stretch. At any rate, it's safe to say that Vettius would have been able to read and write Latin quite proficiently, and he may have had some acquaintance with Greek as well. A weird thing about Vettius is that despite owning a substantial number of slaves, he was indebted. Another odd detail that we learned from Diodorus Siculus is that Vettius's father was still alive in 104, and that makes it less than clear if it was father or son who was the debtor, and whether Vettius owned his own estate or whether he was living with his father and Diodorus was talking about the estate that the family held. We also don't get a very clear picture of how important Vettius was or was not to the running of the family estate. It's possible that he was just a young man pursuing his own interests while his father was running the estate, or perhaps his father was an older gentleman and Vettius had taken over much of the day-to-day operation. We simply don't know, but Diodorus, because of what he wants us to think about Vettius, would have us believe, or at least imply to some extent, that Vettius was only interested in slave girls and that he really didn't have his mind on anything that mattered. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the late Republic may have recognized the year 104 as being quite a significant year in the history of Rome. This is because that was the same year that the Second Servile War broke out. But let us first backtrack to establish the general context of the Servile Wars, or as they are sometimes called, the Slave Wars or Slave Revolts. In 135, the first Servile War raged in Sicily when the slave Eunice rose up, claiming magical powers, and he was able to create a revolt which lasted for 3 years and caused the Romans a great deal of grief. That was a shocking event, and I think that what it did was reveal to the Romans that there was a problem. Over the course of the 2nd century, the Romans had made a great number of conquests, and another social development was that large plantations under rich people had grown, and these plantations would be worked by slaves. This meant that there was a much larger number of slaves in the countryside than there were of free people. Many free people were moving to the cities, and the countryside was becoming increasingly dominated by slaves. This was especially true in Sicily and becoming more true in Italy over time. Many of these slaves were prisoners of war. They had been captured in places like Greece or in the East or in Gaul or Spain. By Gaul, at this point, we could still include northern Italy and the very south of France. We're not talking about the area around Paris or anything of that nature. And the sport of gladiator combat was also becoming increasingly popular, and there was a great deal of demand for it, especially at Rome, where members of the elite would put on gladiatorial shows for the people and for their relatives at funerals and weddings and things of that nature. So this meant that there were a number of gladiatorial schools springing up in both Italy and Sicily. The upshot of all of this is that there were many slaves who, if given a chance, knew exactly how to fight and how to organize militarily. Just to give the broader context, the Second Servile War in Sicily broke out the same year as Vettius's revolt. It raged for 4 years, 104 to 100, and then the Third Servile War, also known as the Spartacus War, broke out in Italy and raged from 73 to 71. The revolt that we're talking about is considered to be its own separate incident, and it is not brigaded with the Second Servile War. The way that we categorize the slave revolts of the late 2nd century owes a great deal to the historian Diodorus Siculus. He lays out the First Servile War and the Second Servile War, and in order to show that these were not just isolated one-off incidents, Diodorus also records that there were 3 minor revolts which took place in between these 2 major wars. The first 2 of these incidents were typical run-of-the-mill slave revolts led by slaves, and they were quickly dealt with. He doesn't go into much detail, and they don't seem terribly interesting. However, the third of these revolts was the one led by Titus Minucius Vettius in 104, which immediately preceded the outbreak of the Second Servile War. Diodorus, as an elite who most likely owned slaves, and certainly was writing for an audience of men who owned slaves and were the beneficiaries of the political system of their day, found Vettius to be curious, as no doubt did Vettius's contemporaries. And Diodorus therefore had to try to explain what it was that drove Vettius to do what he did, to attempt to overthrow the law and order of a system which was designed to benefit men like him. Diodorus came to the conclusion that Vettius must be a madman, that he's driven by insanity. We'll have to talk about that some more. Does insanity quite explain Vettius's actions? Let's take a look. In addition to being someone whom Diodorus found to be insane, young Vettius had another motive that one could classify as ignoble. Young Vettius met and fell in love with a slave woman, and it was his burning desire to purchase her and keep her as his own. However, since he was already in debt, he didn't have a lot of available cash, and when he approached his creditors to talk about getting more money with which to purchase this woman, they refused him. Rather than accepting this, Vettius instead was driven by his passion to plot against the creditors and to claim kingly authority among the slaves. We learn all this from Diodorus's 36th book, if you're interested in reading this for yourself. I think it's safe to say that Diodorus's explanation of Vettius's motives leaves a lot to be desired, But unfortunately, since he is our only source, there's not a lot of information to paint an alternative or better picture. So, if we are to accept Diodorus at face value, we'd have to believe that Vettius decided to lead a full-scale revolt against the Roman Republic, mostly because there was a woman that he was interested in and he wanted to own her as a concubine, and the only way to do that was to engage in a full-scale political revolution. It doesn't seem all that likely to me. If I had to guess, I would think that a lot more of it had to do with his debt situation. Perhaps he came from a family that had fallen out of favor. Maybe he had dreamt of being in the Senate one day, but things had fallen apart. There could be a lot more to this story. I assume his motives have to be a little bit more complex than what Diodorus presents, but unfortunately, we simply don't know because Diodorus didn't see fit to tell us. Whatever Vettius's precise motives, he decided that the best course of action was to arm 400 of his own slaves and then round up his creditors. Diodorus says that it was at this juncture that Vettius truly lost his marbles, since he did something even more unthinkable when he proceeded to flog and decapitate the captured creditors. So why was it this that showed that Vettius must truly be insane? Well, first of all, you would never arm a Roman slave if you were a good, law-abiding, right-minded Roman. Arming a slave was an invitation to disaster. This was especially clear in the wake of the First Servile War. The second thing is that he executed Roman citizens on his own authority, thereby usurping the Senate's authority. The Senate and people of Rome were supposed to have the power over life and death and no one else. Roman citizens, have no doubt that these creditors were Roman citizens, were entitled to a trial, but they didn't get it. And therefore Vettius took the law into his own hands and acted as a tyrant in the eyes of Rome. But of course this would kind of work out for him, since he was claiming to have a special legal authority. Once Vettius raised his banner in revolt, more slaves in Campania flocked to his banner, and his numbers eventually swelled up to around 3,500 men. Vettius then took the title King of Campania. As you might imagine, the deaths of so many prominent men swiftly drew the attention and anger of the Senate, which began to respond immediately. One quick side note, part of the reason why I believe that Vettius's debt problems must have been more severe than we are led to believe, and why that is probably his primary motive, is because if he had 400 slaves, yet he was in deep, deep debt, this would imply that his debt was so bad that he was in danger of losing his inheritance, and that this may have been a desperate gambit to keep his family afloat. At any rate, though, let's see how the King of Campania will handle Rome's revenge. When news of Vettius's uprising reached Rome, the Romans dispatched a praetor, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, with 600 troops and gave him permission and funds to raise more men. At Capua, just on the outskirts of Campania, Lucullus was able to raise 4,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. Since the reforms of Marius had only taken place a few years before, a lot of Romans in the fields, just regular Romans who were farmers, would have still possessed a great deal of military experience from all the times they were called up, so the men that Lucullus was calling to arms would have had experience. And also it's worth noting that as an equestrian himself, Vettius most likely not only had experience serving in the ranks, but he may have held some very minor unit commands as well when he was called up to serve. But most of his men were slaves, so they would not have had that same advantage. Perhaps Vettius had some way to train them to some limited extent before he was forced to face Lucullus in the field. Vettius had around 3,500 men, whereas Lucullus had about 5,000 or so. This meant that Lucullus had an edge in both equipment and manpower, so Vettius knew that fighting head-on was not a very good option. He found a nearby hill, and he hastily fortified the position, preparing to receive Lucullus's assault. Lucullus, having the numbers and the quality on his side, was willing to assault this position, thinking that the rebels would break easily and it would be a slaughter. However, this attack was repulsed, and Vettius's position on the hill held. The high ground works for a lot of people, not just Obi-Wan Kenobi. While his assault had not been successful, Lucullus was far from defeated, and he still held the advantage overall. However, he didn't want to lose any more men attacking a fortified hill, so instead Lucullus tried to divide and conquer. He turned to subterfuge in order to bring down Vettius. Now, Vettius was someone who may not have connected very easily with his immediate subordinates, since he came from a vastly different background than they did, and there may have been some mistrust among them. Lucullus tried to play into that by approaching one of Vettius's generals, a man named Apollonius, presumably a former slave of Greek origin, and he offered Apollonius a full pardon in exchange for his cooperation if he would just betray Vettius. Apollonius gathered his followers, and they began to fight Vettius in the camp. With the rebels divided, they had no way to defend their hill, and Lucullus was able to launch a second assault and largely overrun the camp without too much difficulty. Vettius realized that the cause was lost, and along with a good number of his men, he decided to slit his own throat rather than be captured and then tortured and executed by a vindictive Rome. Surprisingly, one of the oddest details of this battle is that Lucullus actually did honor his word to Apollonius. My expectation while I was reading the narrative is that Lucullus would have Apollonius executed for having revolted against Rome in the first place, but he kept his word, and Apollonius presumably lived happily ever after, with some nightmares and probably a pretty strong sense of guilt, since he was a traitor. Now that Vettius's slave revolt has been crushed and he has slit his own throat, it is time to consider the impact and legacy of Vettius's revolt. First, let's consider the material, physical ramifications of this event. While the praetor Lucullus was busy fighting Vettius, the Second Servile War broke out in earnest in Sicily. Some scholars have speculated that slaves were in many ways the primary conduits of news and information in the Roman world, since they were so abundant and they were often dispatched on errands. They would be in a perfect situation to observe and gossip without attracting a whole lot of notice. It's not unreasonable to assume that a slave revolt in Rome's ritzy backyard helped to inspire the slaves of Sicily to try once again to strive for freedom from oppression. As for Lucullus the praetor, he was reassigned to Sicily when his predecessors in that war proved to be inept. However, while he did have some initial successes and he was on the path to becoming a great Roman leader, he did have some setbacks, and he responded very poorly to being removed of his command and replaced, which led to him being prosecuted and expelled from the Senate. His son later redeemed the name Lucullus. His son pictured here shared the same name, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, and he would prove to be one of the greatest generals that Rome produced during the 60s. But, of course, that is a different topic for a different time. And last, to consider the impact that this revolt by Vettius had on Roman perception and Roman memory. Scholars wonder why the story has been recorded and what Diodorus Siculus intended for his readers to take away. Why did he devote such time to this, and why did he ascribe motives to Vettius as he did? Well, one thing to consider is that most ancient historians during this period saw themselves as something like philosophers to some extent, and they believed that there was something like moral causation, where the characters of great men very much influence their actions and ultimately have an impact on the course of history. A classic example is the notion that the degeneracy of Alcibiades led to the downfall of Athens during the Peloponnesian War. The morals of this story are something like when you fail to maintain self-control and give in to your base desires such as lust or greed, and you let your emotions run wild rather than regulating them with logic and reason, then you are led down a dark path, and this is not good for the Republic or for the common good. Keep in mind the common good, as always, is defined as what is best for the ruling class. Philosophy was inherently a ruling class preoccupation, and therefore encouraging people to remain in whatever role they were born into was a big part of pretty much every ancient system of thought. The scholar Teresa Urbanzik, whose work Slave Revolts in Antiquity was what alerted me to both Vettius's revolt and my recent video on Bulla Felix, says that the reason why Diodorus assigned insanity and lust to Vettius as the chief motives is because they required an explanation for why one of their own, and especially one of their own who was so wealthy and well connected, would do something like this in their own backyard of Campania. These explanations are the only things that make them feel better about themselves. He was just a bad apple, to put it in a more modern parlance. He was someone who had failed to live up to moral expectations. He knew better, but he was immoral. He failed to live up to Rome's high standards. Well, high standards as defined by the Romans and as judged by the Romans. But you get what I'm saying. At any rate, that is the story of Titus Minucius Vettius and his short-lived but very interesting slave revolt. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and hopefully I'll be able to find more fascinating figures from Roman history who may have slipped through the cracks and evaded your perception up until this point.